26% of the current level spending for the current year is borrowed. That should be of huge concern to everybody. The average American has about $100,000 their share of a debt. Think of that. A family of four has $400,000 in their share of the debt. The average person, or the average American in the budget coming up this year will be spending about $20,000.
I yield the gentleman another 15 seconds.
Right. Just follow up one more time. Remember, America has to know that 26% of every Social Security dollar, 26% of every new tank, 20% of every new education dollar is borrowed. And at a time where interest costs are going up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time's expired. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would remind the gentleman this bill would put 1.2 million people in the Badger State at risk of losing Medicaid. With that, I'm very happy to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to State Government Reform Committee. Ms. Plea.
Gentleman recognized.
On behalf of the Massachusetts 7th Congressional District, as the House prepares to vote on a truly horrifying Republican budget resolution, one void of empathy or common sense, I'm thinking of and censoring the people in my district who stand to be harmed the most. Families in Mattapan who receive their health care through Mass Health, the Medicaid program for Massachusetts. Mothers in Chelsea who rely on SNAP to feed their babies. Disabled veterans in Randolph who receive life-saving care and benefits through the VA. Efficiency. Tell me how it is efficient to make people across this country sicker, hungrier, poorer, more vulnerable. Tell me how it is efficient to buy more toy rockets for Donald Trump's billionaire friends while parents can't afford groceries. The cruelty is the point. What a callous shame and a sham. I urge my colleagues to stand with the people, protect families, and reject this shameful budget resolution. In the words of a righteous faith leader whose place of worship Donald Trump recently attended, have mercy. Thank you. I yield.
Gentlewoman yields. Gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves. Gentleman from Texas.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think God had mercy on this country, and he's given us a shot now to turn this country around and to give it back to the American people and to return to common sense policies, to put the American people first and to clean up the mess in Washington, D.C. And we've seen the exposure of the waste and the woke and the bloat, and it's immoral to hand our country like this to the next generation. We're long overdue to get our fiscal house in order, Mr. Chairman. And the American people deserve to keep more of their money. The American people deserve fiduciaries in Congress that will take care to steward their tax dollars. And the people who need these programs that we created for the most vulnerable, they deserve to have the programs without having folks siphon off monies or people ineligible draining those programs. We got a lot of work to do. We won't be intimidated by the rhetoric. We won't be scared into paralysis anymore as a Republican Party. We're standing up with our president and fearless leader, Mr. Donald J. Trump, and we know the American people are behind us 100%. We're leaning in, and we're going to save this country. And we're going to give our children a fighting chance at the blessings of liberty and the land of opportunity. With that, I yield 2 minutes to my good friend, who is a fighter for our freedom and fiscal sanity. He's on the Budget Committee from South Carolina, Mr. Norman.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in full support of the House budget resolution. And Jody, I just want to thank you for the yeoman's work that you've done. You've stood tall and you stood strong. You know, for those who are watching on TV and for those of you who are listening, you know, we got in a steady diet of the same old worn out tactics, rich, poor, divinity politics, taking food from hungry children. You hadn't used Granny is going over the cliff yet, but I assume that's coming. You know, my question to my good friends on the other side, where were you the last 4 years? Where were you? We got a steady diet of high inflation. We got a steady diet of 15 million illegals coming across this country, using every public school, every hospital, not being a citizen, draining the payroll and draining the economy of America. What about the empathy for the poor unaccompanied children who came over here and are in sex trades, and if they're still living, many of them, well over 400,000 children? What about the inflation at every level? Where were you the last 4 years? House prices, where were you? Interest rates, you were nowhere to be found. Where were your solutions? You didn't have any, because we've got a total two world views. You think taxes paid by Americans is your money to spend like you want. Elon Musk and what Donald Trump are doing are identifying the waste. Let the American people judge. 77 million Americans judged on who they thought could lead this country, and it wasn't an inept president who couldn't give a press conference if he had to or read a thank you card. That's who you put up with for 4 years. And folks, the past is the judge of the future. This bill, I would love to have $5 trillion in cuts, but we got.
I yield the gentleman another 30 seconds.
We've got more to go. This is the first step. The journey starts with the first step. We're going to fight, and we're going to stop the policies that have bankrupted this country that y'all have indicated, that y'all have put up with for the last 4 years. Time's up. It's time for a new day. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields. Members are reminded to direct their comments to the chair. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Well, Mr. Chair, I would remind the gentleman that this bill would put 1 million people in South Carolina at risk of losing Medicaid. But I appreciate the previous speaker's candor, his saying that he wants $5 trillion worth of cuts, and to quote him, this is only the beginning. So I hope that every middle-class American hears that and knows what is coming, that by his own words, this is just the beginning. This is bad enough. What are we talking about? $880 billion worth of cuts to Medicaid and the ACA, $230 billion worth of cuts to nutrition programs, $330 billion of cuts to student loan programs, Pell Grants, Head Start, school lunches, and more and more. And why? Also tax cuts worth $4.5 trillion can go to the richest 1% of Americans. With that, Mr. Speaker, I am happy to yield 2 minutes to a wonderful new member of this body, the gentlewoman from New Jersey, a distinguished member of the Transportation Committee, Ms. Poe.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise for the first speech on the floor of this body to reject the Republican so-called budget. I came to Congress to help my constituents. I came here to provide direct relief to struggling Americans and lift people up. This Republican budget does none of those things. It is nothing more than a blueprint for cruelty. This GOP budget will destroy Medicaid and take health care away from millions of Americans. In my district alone, this could strip health care from the 215,000 people on Medicaid, blow up hospital budgets, raise insurance premiums, and all to give trillions in tax cuts to the millionaires. Another cash giveaway to the super rich at the expense of ruining American lives. I reject and I intend to vote no to this cruel Republican budget and yield back. Thank you.
From Pennsylvania reserves. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, my good friend and ranking member made a comment about Mr. Ralph Norman from South Carolina. He said, listen closely to what he said. He'd like to cut $5 trillion from the budget. Well, you know what? Add my name to that list, because the GAO says there's $5 trillion of fraud throughout the four corners of this federal government. That's the people's money. And we ought to spend every waking hour together, across the aisle, bipartisan, to go and root out that waste and fraud that is fleecing the taxpayers. So you can count me in the camp of Mr. Ralph Norman. When the Government Accountability Office says that there are $5 trillion of defrauding the people's government and the people's money. You're not going to hear anybody on the other side of the aisle, and there's some good people and well-intended people. But in this debate, you're not going to hear them talk about illegals being on welfare rolls, or the fact that their president, President Joe Biden, with the stroke of a pen, welcomed illegals on to welfare and health care rolls. We can't even afford Social Security benefits that will, the fund of which will be insolvent within the next 10 years. And instead, we're bringing people that aren't even citizens onto the social safety nets that are paid for by taxpayers. And we're not spending that money, that precious treasure of taxpayers, to shore up Medicare and Social Security. It makes no sense to me, but you know what? It made no sense to the American people, and that's why they gave this president a mandate and gave this country unified Republican leadership. Now, they are still in denial, apparently, and they're definitely disconnected from the reality of the last 4 years. They may have had all the best intentions, but the pain and the suffering that the American people endured because of the reckless record trillions of dollars in spending and the failed economic policies of the last administration is real. They didn't forget it, and they voted with that acid test, that fundamental question: is my life better today? There's never been, I don't think, in American history, a clearer contrast between the two parties, back to back. Republican total control in 17 and 18, Democrat unified leadership on the heels of that, the philosophies, the values, the worldviews, the policies, and the consequences borne by the American people. And they have chosen a very different path, and they have asked us to reverse course and to reverse the curse that looms not only over this country, but our children's future. And I am surprised that I haven't heard one sentence about the waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government at $5 trillion. I'm surprised that I haven't heard any criticisms of the millions of people who've come to this country illegally and drained Medicaid, according to CBO, by billions of dollars. That was a letter in response to an inquiry that we sent. How much of the tax dollars in Medicaid are being siphoned off for people who are here illegally? I can't believe that there's not more indignation on account of the fact that $9,000 is what we're spending on people who broke the law, violated our sovereignty, and are here in this country illegally, and taxpayers are spending $9,000 per illegal immigrant for social services that were intended for the United States citizens. And that $9,000 represents more money than we spend on our own vulnerable American citizens on Medicaid. But you're not going to hear any of that today. But the American people know better. They've always had the better judgment, and they made the right call. And we aim to deliver for them. I don't know if my colleagues, how much time do I have, Mr. Chairman, remaining?
Minutes remaining.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
May I inquire as to how much time I have remaining?
Gentleman has 4¼ minutes remaining.
I am prepared to close.
Gentleman's recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself the balance of my time. First, let me say before my closing, my good friend and chair of the Budget Committee, and we've worked closely together in opposition a lot of the time, but actually in agreement some of the time with some real achievements, though not today. He said something that really interests me, that there's this GAO report showing $5 trillion of fraud. Well, I certainly would be interested in seeing that report. The size of the entire budget every year is only $6.5 trillion. So how in the world $5 trillion out of $6.5 trillion is really fraud? I find that a little hard to believe. Now, Mr. Chairman, we are at a pivotal moment. I said at the beginning of this debate some 2.5 hours ago that this budget resolution represents the Republican betrayal of the middle class. For the last 2.5 hours, you have heard speaker after speaker expose exactly why that is so. First and foremost, and I think most crucially, the $880 billion in cuts to Medicaid, the largest cuts in American history to Medicaid. Why is that important? 72 million Americans rely on Medicaid. Another 20 million rely and get their health care through the Affordable Care Act. They are also at risk. We have heard further that while those are the biggest cuts, there are even more, hundreds of billions of dollars in cuts to nutrition assistance, school lunch programs, Pell Grants, Head Starts, and the list goes on and on. And why? All to deliver $4.5 trillion of tax cuts to the richest 1% of Americans. And let's not forget the fact that in order to cover the rest of the cost of those tax cuts, they are increasing the debt limit by $4 trillion. They like to talk about debt and how horrible it is, but this piece of legislation will make our debt situation far worse. This is the Republican betrayal of the middle class. Day after day, in my home state of Pennsylvania, you had candidates from both sides talking about how the number one priority should be to lower costs for Americans. The president made that promise. He said he would do it on day one. Well, here we are, more than a month in, not one executive order, not one bill to lower costs for the American people. Instead, we have this bill to take money from the middle class and give it to those who need it the least. Mr. Speaker, I am proud to lead the opposition to this Republican betrayal of the middle class. I urge every member of this House to vote no. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make my closing remarks consume as much time as we have on the clock here, but let me also pay respects to my ranking member. He is a great guy. He has been a really good partner. We've done some really important things together on a bipartisan basis. In fact, we've passed more bipartisan legislation to fix the broken budget process, which doesn't serve either party in this institution well, and I give him equal credit, if not more credit, because when you're in the minority, there's tremendous pressure not to work with the majority. But he's an American first, and we may disagree, but I know where his heart is. Now, let me answer the question of the ranking member. The $5 trillion is a CBO score. That's a 10-year budget window score, just like the $2 trillion that we have as a goal to reduce reckless, wasteful, and fraudulent spending. Now, Mr. Chairman, the reconciliation process is generally to reconcile the House and Senate budgets, but more than a process for matching up revenues and outlays, this exercise, more importantly, is reconciling the difference between the American people's interest, expectations, and values, and a federal government that has totally lost its way, forgotten who it serves, and too often has failed to faithfully and fairly and efficiently execute the laws of the land. And if we learned anything from the November election, it's that the American people want a strong country. They want a competent leader, common sense policies, and they want all of us to put America first. And that's what this budget resolution does. I'd like to think of this budget resolution as a promissory note to our children, to preserve safeguarding it from an unwieldy government and with unbridled spending, taxing, and regulating that threatens to destroy it. Mr. Chairman, I said this in the Budget Committee, and I'm going to say it now to close. The era of wasteful, woke, and weaponized government is over, and this budget resolution will be its tombstone. Here lies one of the darkest chapters in American history: open borders, record crime, lawlessness, feckless foreign policies, cost of living crises. Enough. It's time to reverse the curse. It's time to reverse the reckless spending, the failed policies, do the first and most important job of the federal government, keep the American people safe. That's exactly what we intend to do, and that's exactly what we've delivered with this framework. So, Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to vote yes on House Concurrent Resolution 14, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman, Mr. Schweikert, and the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Beyer, each will control 30 minutes on the subject of economic goals and policies. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
And Mr. Chairman, and to the minority, I first want to apologize to everyone. I have one of my crappy lung infections, so at some point I'm going to start coughing and doing an inhaler. Just ignore me. Somehow I thought that'd be funnier. Mr. Chairman, and to my good friend Mr. Beyer, this I think is somewhat of a unique opportunity for those of us from the Joint Economic Committee. We actually take math seriously. We don't always see things alike. But the fact of the matter is, the Joint Economic Committee, I think started in 1956, has this remarkable history of some of the world's greatest economists coming and speaking before it and walking us through it. And that's why this moment, we're going to try to do something that's special. Instead of just sort of sharing feelings, I'm going to ask us to share math. And within that, we're going to walk through what's actually in the budget resolution. This is a reconciliation budget. It's not a regular budget. This is a budget that opens up the ability, because the insanity we go through of moving something through the Senate and it's 60 votes. So the 1974 Budget Control Act, this is the dance we go through. The other thing I'm going to try to walk through is where the actual math lays in the box that's been given to us by the Budget Committee. And then the part I'm going to do, the Schweikert little bit of hope, is this the moment? Is this the moment of policy that actually forces us, both the left and the right, that if there's cuts, modernization, changes, updates in methodology of how we deliver services, is this the stressor that makes us do something that's hard, but also do something that's truthful? I'm also going to try repeatedly to make the point, Mr. Chairman, and show why are we primarily doing this. We have a handful, actually a bunch of provisions of the 2017 tax reform that begin to expire. Most of those provisions actually are the benefit of small businesses and the working class. And I will show that over and over, and the distributional effects. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in opposition to this budget resolution, and I yield such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this budget is disastrous for the American economy. It will balloon our deficits, it will lead to higher interest rates, and will make the things Americans buy every day more expensive. It will slash critical investments in the things that make us healthier, safer, and more productive, things like cancer research, aviation security, and our national park system. And it will decimate critical programs that support the people we represent, stripping health care from millions and make it harder for families to put food on the table and make ends meet. All of this for billionaires and corporations that get tax cuts they do not need and that our country cannot afford. I'm pleased to do this with my friend, Chairman Schweikert. I also believe in math, and I rarely brag, but I'm good at math. Americans have been clear. They want lower prices and an economy that works for them. Yet instead of focusing on making life easier for American families, at every turn, this administration and our Republican colleagues have engaged in a scorched earth policy. A policy that creates chaos across the country as the richest person on the planet eliminates services that our nation depends upon. My friend from South Carolina earlier said the policies would bankrupt our country. What's he mean? Health care for our families? Food for the working poor who overwhelmingly live in Republican districts? Sure, get rid of any identified bloat, as every president does. But this is a budget about billionaires, not about the every American women, men, and children we represent. Yes, I want to move towards a much smaller budget deficit. I listen to David Schweikert every closing afternoon during his special order hours. I hate the higher interest costs. But who pays? Our families or the 1,000 billionaires? That small percentage, 1% or less, of American population that has way more wealth than they could ever spend in lifetimes to come. You know, this budget depends on, my Republicans have long sung from the altar of fiscal responsibility, yet the plan they put in front of us today is a fiscal sacrilege. It depends on fantasy math. It ignores that their deficit-busting tax breaks will add at least $4.6 trillion on our nation's credit card, adding even more interest that our families must pay. And this interest has real costs. It slows economic growth. It depresses the standard of living. It leads to higher inflation. Higher interest rates, already faced with high prices and borrowing costs to make ends meet. Wasteful, woke, and weaponized policies, my friend from Texas said, that's a very small percentage of the federal budget. You're going to never achieve what's in this budget resolution on wasteful, woke, and weaponized policies. So what is this Republican plan? How do they address? They double down on the policies that will widen the growing wealth gap this nation by giving billionaires trillions in handouts while providing pennies to the middle class. According to the Treasury Department, the top 1% of Americans, those making over $750,000 a year, can expect to get an annual tax cut of over $32,000. Working families will see a tiny fraction of that. Of course, the other main beneficiaries will be the wealthiest executives of the wealthiest corporations at a time when corporate profits are at an all-time high. Americans who rely on government services will be told they need to make sacrifices to pad those profit margins even further. How does that make any sense? To pay for these tax cuts for the ultra-wealthy, the Republican budget proposes to cut programs Americans rely on to afford health care and to put food on the table. Almost 100 million Americans, including seniors, children, families, and those from every corner of this country, depend on Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act to afford medical care. Yet this budget would slash almost $900 billion from these critical programs, ripping away life-saving coverage and raising health care costs for those who rely on them. And at a time when prices at the grocery stores continue to climb, this budget would make it even harder for the 40 million Americans who rely on SNAP to put food on the table. The budget we are considering today will nothing to support the economic growth of this nation. It will benefit the wealthiest at the expense of those who make this country work, and I urge my colleagues to reject it. With that, I reserve, Madam Speaker.
The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. All right, I've got to figure out, do I sit here and just spend my time correcting things that are mathematically not true or not in the design of what's actually here, or just over and over say how much I like working with Mr. Beyer because one day you'll be the chair and I'll be in your position. So let's actually walk through some basic math together. What will our spending be this year? It will be $7 trillion. What is actually in the cuts, remember the horrible draconian cuts, is $120 billion in a year. So 7 trillion, a trillion is 1,000 billion for those of you who are math dysfunctional. Let's walk through. And 120 billion is the Armageddon. So let's actually have a little, and we're probably going to end up using these a couple times here because I think they make a point. The way a reconciliation budget is laid out, it creates a series of boxes. Here's all these authorizing committees. We need you to find savings. We need you to find those savings through modernization, through waste and fraud. And we're going to spend a little time actually talking about some great documents even the Biden administration produced on waste and fraud. And I'm sure every member here has actually read them and some of the other articles we have from Wall Street Journal doing on Medicare Advantage and all these others. And many of them, when all added up, are $1 trillion+ dollars. Are we capable of actually being intellectually honest and walking through? So one of the charts, and we're going to come back to this again, is you've been hearing the Armageddon being said, but it's Medicaid. Look, I used to do my state's Medicaid budgets. Now, Arizona has a somewhat unique system. We actually buy managed care, capitated policies for our indigent population, and it's remarkably effective. And we deliver remarkably effective health care cheaper than almost every other state in the country, demonstrating that actually plan design, managed design, actually can both be much healthier for our society and save money. But you don't actually start to have those revolutionary conversations in Congress until you have moments of stress like this. So once again, I just want to add, in the document, 96% of the budget authority within energy and commerce is not touched. We're talking 4% of their budget authority, and that's spread over a decade. If we can't find 4% of modernization in these programs, we're actually in much more trouble than even just the brain trust here as we tell our stories. And with that, Madam Chair, I reserve.
The gentleman from Arizona reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. While we're doing math, when I divide $2 trillion in savings and cuts over 10 years, I get $200 billion a year. With that, let me recognize the gentlelady from Massachusetts, the whip of the House Democratic Caucus, Ms. Clark.
How much time?
For 4 minutes, Madam Speaker.
The gentlewoman's recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Despite all the promises on the campaign trail, House Republicans have chosen to do 3 things with their majority: raise the cost of putting food on the table, raise the cost of getting health care, and use that money, deserving taxpayers' money, to cut billionaires' taxes. That's it. That's the agenda. And let's look at the scale of what they're sacrificing. Funding that feeds 15 million children, a program that pays for half of all the births in America, a service that keeps nursing homes and health centers' doors open, all to cut Elon's taxes. If that sounds outrageous to you, Madam Chair, and I sure hope it does, you are not alone. Let's be clear about the kind of money we're talking about. You know what it costs to keep a kid on Medicaid? $10 a day. How about keeping that child fed with SNAP benefits? $6 a day. What do Republicans want to give away to the already rich? $6 million per billionaire. Think about that. For a billionaire, $6 million is not even a rounding error. For a hungry child, it's enough to eat every single day for 34 lifetimes. Inflicting hunger on children to give billionaires money they don't need and won't even notice, there is no moral code under which that is acceptable. There is no public demand for it. There is no logical reason for it other than total fealty to billionaire donors, billionaires who will never feel they have enough. I'll close with a family that has been on my mind. A mom-to-be, 5 months pregnant. She and her husband are happy, they're in love, and they are excited for their daughter to arrive. But every month, their budget is tight. They get a little bit of help from food pantries, but sometimes, even if they arrive by 6 a.m., the food is already gone. Without the SNAP program, the mom said, I honestly don't know what we would do. Honestly, don't know what we would do. Every Republican has a choice to make with this vote. Will they vote to keep that mom and her daughter fed, or will they keep padding the pockets of those who will not even notice? The American people can forgive a lot, but they will not forgive this betrayal. I yield back.
Reserve.
The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Woman, look, I love public policy by storytelling, but this being the Joint Economic Committee, let's actually go back to math. And to Mr. Beyer, I want to make sure I'm communicating right, but at least we're down to, instead of the Armageddon, his number was, well, if you cut $2 trillion over 10 years, that's $200 billion. He's right, but that's actually not what's in the document here. It's functionally 1.2 with a shock absorber. Once again, I'll give you the shock absorber, depending on what Ways and Means ultimately does. So thank you again. I mean, it shows actually we're fairly close on math. Another thing, and this is just someone who actually had worked on the tax reform in 2017 and the storytelling that has existed, particularly with my brothers and sisters on the left. Madam Chairwoman, how would you feel if I could document to you that the post-2017 tax reform was more progressive? Now, there were lower rates, but the top portion of income earners actually were paying a higher percentage of federal income tax. So when you actually start looking at this, remember, and this is the distributional problem that I was going to try to walk through. I believe when you do the math here, 5% of the population, now these are people making stunning amounts of money. And if we want to have a discussion, should they pay more? Guess what? This opens up that discussion because there are no rates locked into this. It just creates the capacity to now have the discussion. But the fact of the matter, the top 5% pay 38% of all federal income taxes. Functionally half the workers in the United States pay less than 1%. And the bottom, and I'll take a correction if someone actually knows the actual number, I think the bottom 25% actually receives more because substantially earned income tax credit, which is the old negative income tax model. Look, we have a distributional problem. If you want to have a discussion of wealth and income equality, I have some great charts to show you of what inflation did, what the previous punctually 3.5 years of inflation did to wealth in the working class. When you inflate up people who have assets and you crush those who are trying to survive, congratulations. But remember, before the pandemic, under the TCJA, the tax reforms of 2017, it was the fastest closure of income inequality in American history. What's being discussed here is, do you allow those very tax benefits for small businesses, for individuals, to expire? Now, we don't get a huge economic pop from continuing them. You maintain consumption, but we know if you don't do them, that loss of consumption in those populations actually really hurts us economically. I'm going to reserve in a moment, but then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about some of the other provisions that we're just, once again, Madam Chair, just trying to create the capacity so we can actually have the more elegant debate of what should the distributional effects be? Where do we get the most economic growth from? And next time we're going to come back, let's actually do a bit of where the economic growth can come from, and we'll walk through what the model of expensing and those things. And with that, I reserve.
The gentleman from Arizona reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To add to the distributional impacts, the top 5% pay 38% of the taxes, but they have more than 60% of the wealth. The bottom 10% pay very little, but live hand to mouth, including more than 12% of our children. Madam Chair, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, the chairman, the distinguished chair of the House Democratic Caucus, Mr. Aguilar.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in opposition to this Republican budget. House Democrats came to Congress ready to work with our Republican colleagues to lower the cost of eggs, take on price gouging, expand the child tax credit, build more housing, and put the pocketbooks of working families first. This is what the American people told us was their top priority. And these are the issues that drive our caucus. Instead, Madam Chair, they have turned their attention to the only policy priority that they really care about: ensuring billionaires pay less. My constituents can't afford eggs at the local grocery store, while my Republican colleagues are fighting amongst themselves about who to hand out tax breaks to, corporations or individuals. Tesla pays $0 in federal taxes, while teachers and firefighters in San Bernardino are paying more than their fair share. Here is the reality, Madam Chair. My Republican colleagues are going to take away health care from more than 10 million Californians to pay for tax cuts for billionaires. This is not going to make the cost of eggs cheaper or housing less expensive, but it is going to put children and seniors who need health care at risk. House Democrats believe that the people who work for a living ought to get a little breathing room, and the wealthy and well-connected shouldn't get special treatment. The Republican budget is not good for the economy, it's not good for the country, and it's a betrayal of the middle class. I urge a no vote.
The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I actually made a board for what the gentleman's point was, showing that within this budget this reconciliation budget document, how much additional tax cuts are there for C corporations? There's your board. Being a little sarcastic, but that's sort of a personality trait. The fact of the matter is, once again, the talking points don't match up with the reality here. Your taxes, everyone in this room, your taxes go up at the end of this year. If you run a small business, a pass-through, not a C corporation, a pass-through, your taxes go up. If you're part of an employee-owned company, so you've come together and you're managing yourselves almost like an employee co-op, your taxes go up. Now, what also do I hope, but I don't know if the capacity that this creates will allow us to do it, but I sure hope so. We have some great data, and I won't make you live through my charts, that show expensing. Research and development expensing and expensing. It has a cost in the 10-year window. Okay, hopefully everyone has listened to my dozens and dozens and dozens of speeches walking through what expensing is. Expensing is nothing more than depreciation. Do you take it in 1 year or, let's pretend, 7 years? but you still get the exact same amount of reduction in your taxes. It's a timing effect. The difference is if you can take it in the first year, if you do it over 7, you have to finance it. We actually have great economic modeling that shows when you do expense research and development, when you do expensing, you actually get a virtuous cycle of, well, we bought the piece of equipment, so we do it better, faster, cheaper. Well, our competitors just did it. The next year, we got to do it again. And that was one of the reasons, particularly pre-pandemic, we had that sudden spike of capital expenditures in productivity. The punchline on that is that actually does not exist now for those C corporations, which actually have their rates already locked in, but also for all those other small businesses to make those capital expenditures. Why is this really important? Well, there's lots of data that shows that part of the tax code, actually the tax code does, from an economic growth standpoint, create incredible vitality. And it's a timing effect. It's the tyranny of living within a 10-year window in our models. I just hope that actually starts to elevate a little bit of the economics discussion instead of the storytelling. And with that, I reserve.
Gentleman from Arizona reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Madam Chair, I am thrilled to yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Wisconsin, a distinguished member of both the Ways and Means Committee and the Joint Economic Committee, Ms. Moore.
The gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and Mr. Beyer. You know, Republicans pretend to care about the nation's debt and annual deficits, but they have instructed Ways and Means to add $4.5 trillion to the debt to provide tax cuts to the wealthiest. Now, what we have heard from our Republican opponents here today, that if we don't pass this resolution, that everybody's taxes are going to be raised. Well, I'll tell you what. There will be crumbs from the master's table for the average American earning under $200,000 a year versus tax cuts for the wealthiest corporations and individuals. That is the math. I know how fond you are of math. That is the arithmetic. And let me tell you, the handouts to the wealthiest will come on the backs of the least of us. From affordable health care to the ACA and Medicaid, veterans health care, nursing home coverage, food assistance, student loan repayment options, energy tax credits, national security, cancer research. You all contend that the 78 million people voted for this. No, they did not. 15 seconds.
15 more seconds, Madam Chair.
No, 78 million people did not vote for this. Who do you think you are fooling? And they are not fooled by your notion that somehow these tax cuts are going to pay for themselves. And they're backed up by all kinds of economists, the CBO, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget.
Time has expired, and members are reminded to address their comments to the chair.
We reserve, please. Madam Chair.
The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Madam Chair, average family, $2,853. That's your crumbs. I would argue for the average family that have been crushed by the previous 3-4 years in inflation. If you don't make 27% more money in my district, you are poorer today than you were 4 years ago. Having their taxes go up $2,853, and that's the average. And I promise you, I think in my district, it was closer to $3,300. I'm blessed to have a more prosperous district. That is not crumbs, Madam Chair. And with that, I reserve.
Gentleman from Arizona reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Madam Chair, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Illinois, a distinguished member of the Joint Economic Committee and our preeminent environmental economist.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, I want you to imagine that a friend came over to you and said, Donald Trump taught me how to save 50% on my shoe purchases. All you got to do is cut off one leg. It's just math, as the gentleman from Arizona says. So let's get out the saw and head to Foot Locker. Now, if you were a good friend, you would tell them you're crazy and you need to stop thinking that Donald Trump likes you. But here we are today, talking about the idea that we're going to save money by gutting Medicaid, slashing food assistance, defunding white-collar law enforcement, the police, and exploding budget deficits so that we can do what Donald Trump told you he wants, give a $4.5 trillion tax cut to the wealthiest Americans. And so I would say to my Republican colleagues, as a friend, Donald Trump doesn't like you. He doesn't really like anybody. He just assumes that you will never find the courage to stand up to him, so he's going to keep asking you for more until you finally do. If you are sick of being bullied, if you're ready to act like the leaders you claim to be and make sure that we leave this country in a little better shape than we found it, grow a spine and vote hell no on this budget resolution. I yield back.
I reserve.
Members are reminded to award the President. Gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from Arizona.
Madam Chair, may I inquire into time? I may need you to go more.
The gentleman from Arizona has 16 and a half minutes remaining. The gentleman from Virginia has 18 minutes remaining.
Okay. Madam Chair, I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Arizona reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Madam Chair, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Illinois, the distinguished ranking member of the China Select Committee, Mr. Krishnamurthy.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, I rise today as the ranking member of the Select Committee on the Strategic Competition with the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, to express serious concerns about the proposed cuts in the Republicans' budget resolution. First, the resolution includes $880 billion in cuts to programs that risk stalling the advancement of technologies crucial to our competition with the CCP. Second, these cuts will likely jeopardize our ability to enforce critical export controls with the Chinese, as well as gutting programs that help us reshore manufacturing from China. While we got to restore our fiscal house, these cuts to critical programs amount to the GOP's perverted version of DEI, devastating, extreme, and irresponsible. The CCP is cheering for the GOP budget resolution tonight. I object.
I yield. The
gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from Arizona
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
is recognized.
Hey, can you believe this, Madam Chairwoman and my friend Mr. Beyer? We broke our printer. But thank heaven we didn't break the markers. So I thought actually just because we're doing we're trying to do fact-based, the average family, your taxes are going up at the end of this year, $2,853, and 62% of taxpayers, 62% of taxpayers will see hikes. And and I'm sorry we just didn't have time to make a much prettier chart for everyone. Remember, after 2017, we actually moved up, but some of that was some of the deductions and things were added. We moved up the threshold, so almost the half of our tax-paying population actually didn't pay income taxes. They still had payroll taxes and FICA and those things. A bunch of that population that has not paid taxes in years and years and years will be getting tax bills with the opposition to this. Madam Chair, I'm going to reserve, and then we'll come back and go over more.
Gentleman from Arizona reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Madam Chair, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from New York, the distinguished ranking member of the Administration Committee, Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank the distinguished gentleman.
The gentleman's recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank my friend, the gentleman from Virginia, for giving me time. I rise today in strong opposition to this budget resolution. As an Appropriations Committee member, thoughtful consideration of government spending is a responsibility I don't take lightly. I believe every hard-earned taxpayer dollar must work for all Americans, not fuel widely irresponsible economic theory. I'd like to think my colleagues on the other side of the aisle believe the same thing, given the rhetoric we've all heard over the last several years. So I encourage the American people to watch what House Republicans do, not what they say. Remarkably, instead of lowering costs, this reckless budget resolution bestows tax cuts for the wealthiest 1% of Americans while jeopardizing essential health care and nutrition programs. For this reason, I strongly oppose the budget resolution authored